So we've talked about proportion and place and components of application. So now we have to get into how do we properly employ them. Ready? So if you're getting to the question of how do we properly apply, not mystery to you, I'm going to say it's regular use of all 4 applicational questions. So, just to remind you, remember the first question was what to do? Remember the second? Where? Third? Why? And the fourth? How? All right. So as you think about those 4 questions, it may help to remember that they're actually fitting into a sermon whose main points typically are explanation, illustration, application. And as you look at that kind of DNA helix of a main point, it's good to recognize that these protein strands, as it were, these things that make up this living body of the sermon, all right, are actually combinations of 2 things. They are concepts and terms, all right? They are going into the construction of the explanation, illustration, application. If you think about when application begins, just to construct our model here, when does application begin? In the introduction, where you are identifying the burden of the sermon, as it were. What's the reason for this message? Now, I think for most of us, what that means is there's often some form of a human interest account that begins the message, right? Which you're talking about people in situations of some sort, and you're identifying the burden for the message. You put a man in a hole, but the hole is whatever is the spiritual struggle this text is identifying. And we usually begin application by saying, what's a struggle that people we can identify with in our church, in our situation, our culture, in our land, and whatever. We identify the struggle, and then we say, how's the Bible going to be dealing with this, right? Which leads to, if you just think of it, a series of main points that are setting up the structure, right? Each main point being these structures. But having said that, if we're actually beginning application by identifying the burden of the message way up here, then we have a different agenda even for the concepts and terms of our main points. All right? It's setting a different agenda. And by that, I don't mean that we're failing to identify what the text says, but even in the wording of main points, we are answering the question, what does God want us to believe? This in the history of preaching is known as principalizing, made up word, principalizing main points. We are not just saying, what does the text say? In which case I might be something like, Noah built, Noah floated, Noah sinned. Right? Now, that is what the text says. Right? And many people, if they're just thinking about, I want to explain the text, so I want to say what the text says, are doing a standard description of the text. Okay? So that's what they're doing. And this is known as describing the text. What it is automatically not doing is applying the text. Okay? In order to apply the text, we have to not only say, what does the text say? Important question, but far better to word main points to say, what does God want me to believe? What does God want me to believe? Which means that I'm going to word these main points based upon the truth of the text, but in terms of what their significance is. All right? Even from the beginning, what is the significance of the text? I principalize the text. So what does that allow me to do? If I'm not just saying what does the text say, but what does God want me to believe, number one may mean God calls me to follow God's instruction. God wants me to believe that I should follow God's instruction. God also wants me to believe that I should endure life's storms. Finally, I should seek God's mercy. Now, what is the basis of my saying I should follow God's instruction? What in the text is telling me that I should follow God's instruction? What did Noah do? He built the ark. Now, the principle was, what were we being taught? In order to endure what God intended, he followed God's instruction. Right? And having followed God's instruction, what was he prepared for? To endure life's storms. What was going to be the greatest storm of his life? His own sin and the sin of his family, in which he would have to seek God's mercy as well. Right. Now, not trying to evaluate, good or bad outline, good or bad wording, whatever it is. For the moment, I'm simply saying this is a fair summary of the text in which I am principalizing the text. Why do I want to principalize the text? Because ultimately, these main point statements are going to be applied to situations, right? These main points are going to be applied to situations. And a main point that says, Noah built the ark is accurate, true facts, I can't apply it. Right? It's not a principle. Main points, in order to be applicable, are universal truths that are established by text facts. The facts establish the truths, but I'm prepared to preach them because I have worded them as a principle, not as a descriptor. So you recognize this terminology, I'm moving from my exegetical outline to what, when I preach it, a homiletical outline. And the progress from exegetical outline, Noah built the ark, Noah went through the storm, Noah sinned. That's a chronological, exegetical, truthful outline. But what moves it to a homiletical outline is to say, what is the significance of those facts? In particular, what am I to believe? Right? What truth is God meaning for me to take away? What am I to believe as a consequence of, what's the personal consequence of the truth? What am I to believe? And once I have these principles, I will be able to deal with the application. So, if I'm going to be preaching this message, and I've just got main point 1 there, can you just imagine? So, I've only got one main point now, so I should follow God's instruction. I may talk about an illustration, not just about Noah. What about a kid in high school who's trying to, in our part of the country, have a prayer at the flag, and friends and neighbors and principal and teachers are making fun of him when he's trying to build something to honor the Lord, right? So that's my illustration. What's my application going to be? Not just the kid who's trying. What's my application going to be? When you're at work trying to build a career, saying you're going to do it with integrity, and you're not going to lie on your expense report, and you're not going to do impure things in the hotel room, you're going to live for the Lord, you're going to build a career that's faithful to God, despite what neighbors and friends and people laugh at you when you're doing it. What am I doing? I'm taking that truth, I'm going to keep following God's instruction, even when people make fun of me, even when I don't see the result, whatever are these other subpoints in here, and I'm going to bring them to deal with a situation that my people face. This truth dealing with the situational reality of the application. We can't do it if all we do is describe the text. right? I can't apply Noah built the ark. If I am going to apply it, I have to find some principle in order to be able to apply it. So to be able to move expositionally, we principalize the text as a way of going through it. The second thing we do normally is, as we follow God's instruction, endure life's storm, follow God's mercy, is, some of you recognize, good homiletical planning will alter things so that I not only have principles, I have parallel language. Right? The reason we have parallel language in preaching is because, again, most people only perceive our sermons as doctrinal essays. They only hear that wall of words coming. We know our structure. We're looking at our outline. Our people are not typically looking at our outline. If they are looking at outline because you put it in the bulletin, the primary thing they are doing is not following your message with the outline you put in the bulletin. The primary reason they are using the outline in the bulletin is to time your sermon. It's the primary reason they would use it, right? We hate that, don't we? But that's the primary reason that they are. Most people are not taking notes, right? They are not getting greater clarity. They're actually being distracted by the outline. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at the rhetorical studies. They are not paying more attention. They're paying less attention because of the outline. Most people. Certain people are using the outline with diligence, grant you. Well-trained, well-schooled, they are. But most people are simply saying, how long till lunch? Well, let's see. He's down here somewhere. All right. Now, having said that, that was kind of fun to say. The reason that we use parallel language is because we are not in a written medium when we're preaching. We are in an oral medium, all right? We are speaking not to the eye, we are speaking to the ear. And the way in which the ear hears structure is with parallel language. So I will tell you, when I encourage my students to put main points in parallel language, okay? Verbs, subjects, objects line up in order. They go, oh goodness, what kind of artificial, mechanical, unnatural speaking is that? And I have to say, actually, this is the most natural form of communication you can do if you're thinking about conversation and not essays. Right? Because if you're writing essays, what does your English teacher say to you? Don't keep using the same words. That's redundant. That's what your English essay writer says, teacher says. What does your homiletics professor say? Keep using the same words, because what's one of your most powerful means of oral communication? Repetition. We are not reading what you're saying, okay? We're listening to what you're saying. And having parallel language with keyword changes. Hear that? Parallel language with keyword changes means the ear hears another main idea, and here's the idea. What changed? What similar says, this is the main idea. What changed is, here's the specific aspect of it. Now, this is true in every oral culture that we know of. It is not just, homiletics professors and so forth. After all, what do you remember of the Sermon on the Mount? If you think of the structure, what is the standard way that Jesus keeps introducing new subjects through the Sermon on the Mount? What does he say? You have heard it said, but I say to you. Okay? You have heard it said that you shall not murder. I say to you, if you even say to your brother, you fool, you are in danger of hellfire. You have heard it said, you should not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you even look at a woman with what's the word? Lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery. What's he doing? Parallel language with keyword changes. All right? And you don't just have to look there. How does the Sermon on the Mount begin? Blessed are the. Blessed are the. Blessed are the. Why? Oral language, oral culture. All right? And how does that work? Parallel language with keyword changes. If you listened not to because your homiletics professor was requiring it, but you just were explaining to your teen, listen, first, I want you to go to the grocery store and pick up X. Next, I want you to go to the gas station and fill up the tank. Third, I want you to go to the elementary school and pick up your little sister. Now, it's just natural communication. What did I just do? Parallel language, keyword changes. Okay? It's the normal way we talk. What actually is happening when you're asking people to write sermons is you're actually asking them to return to conversational speech and get away from essays. Okay? Parallel language with keyword change. It is the most natural way to make people listen to what you're saying and know what you're saying. It's that wall of words. Don't be redundant. Now the wall of words is coming. Versus repetition, it says, here's major idea. And then when the major idea is worded as an instruction, what do you want me to believe? And I apply it to a situation, now I understand. By the way, it is not just keeping the concepts clear. It is keeping our authority in place. Okay? Because here's what's happened. So often, because we preach this way, explanation is up here, and we've now got, more explanation, other main point, other subpoints in here. Then we've got this illustration. Then way down here we start doing application, and we start saying, and therefore, in order to honor God, you need to tithe. Where in the world did you talk about that before? Where did that, what blue sky did that come out of? And they have no concept that what we are giving as duties down here is connected to the explanation up there. But if what we are doing is we are maintaining key terms, follow God's instruction, and we give an illustration in which somebody did not obey the word of God, what did they do? They followed God's instruction. Right? We're using the same terms. Right? We say, well, this means the same thing. Not to the ear, it doesn't. Right? We're becoming English writers versus preachers. Preachers use the same terms, and the reason is because now I'm going to talk about somebody in a situation that's very difficult. A kid in school is being laughed at by his friends when he won't go to the R-rated movies, and I say, even when your friends are laughing at you, you should do what? Follow God's instruction. I don't say be faithful to God's standards. The first thing I say is follow God's instruction. Because that is the truth that I established by my exegesis. Okay? So when I don't use that truth, but reword a different way in order to even satisfy our own sense of non-repetitiveness, we're actually damaging our authority. Because what I have the authority to say, kind of standard homiletic rubric is, you apply what you explained. You apply what you explained. And that means not just the principle, but the wording. Okay? What changes is the situations, not the instructions. Okay? The instructions are your authority. This is what you said the Word of God said. Now for you to change terms, change duties, unfold other things is going to confuse people, and they think you don't have the authority to say that. And you and I have all lived under that preaching, right? We get to the application, we say, your text didn't say that. Where'd you get that from? It just goes away when it's not just the terms, it's not just the concepts that are kept consistent. It is the terms that are kept consistent. It's the situations that change. You with me so far? So I'm going to give you just a possibility here. So imagine, here is my exegetical outline. Can you just hear? Okay, just Israel approached Jericho. 2, Israel marched around Jericho. 3, the walls of Jericho fell. Exegetical or homiletical outline? Exegetical. Okay, it's just a chronological rendering. Okay. Now, how can you take Israel approached Jericho, Israel marched around Jericho, Israel witnessed the walls following, and turn it into a Homiletical outline. What does God want you to believe? If your facts are Israel approached Jericho. If Israel approached Jericho, why were they approaching Jericho? God told to. Okay, so let's just kind of say, if I were to begin to say, we have to follow the path that God instructs. Follow the path God instructs. How do I know Israel did that? They went up against Jericho. Did they like that? No, we'll just be like little grasshoppers against those people, But they did what? They followed God's path. Once they followed God's path, they marched around Jericho. What were they doing? They were not just following God's path. What were they doing?
Following God's plan.
They're following God's plan. Okay? We have parallel wording, keyword changes. Okay? They're following God's plan. And as a result of following God's plan, which, by the way, is what we are also called to do, right? That's now, what does God want me to believe? Not just what does the text say. What does God want me to believe? I should follow God's plan. And now, Israel witnessed the walls following. What did Israel do?
There was found a substitute.
They depended on God's power. Something like that. I'm just going to stop for a second, not only to get the other board in place, but to see if you have questions about things I just said. Because I typically find, depending on where you've been trained, as basic as what I just said, sometimes it just throws people. Because they've been in institutions where an exegetical outline is the same thing as a homiletical outline. Okay? And so they feel like, wait, I'm not being required to say what the text says anymore. Actually, you are being required to say what the text says. But you are being required to say the exegetical outline is not the end of the homiletical process. Okay? The facts become principles. And you're preaching the principles that are sustained by what? The facts. The facts have to be able to prove those principles. Right? The explanation is of the main point that you stated. So I have to prove that main point principle is sustained by the facts of the text. So I've still got that explanatory process. Josh?
So when you're preaching through narrative sections, you got a lot of narrative in a row. Do your outlines always look similar to that? Or do you vary it up sometimes more, take a little more time telling the story, and then having and then a little more summary principles afterwards? Just for even a little bit of variety?
Yes. So let's just even do this. It's just like a new day. So, explanation, illustration, application. But we recognize, of course, what if the thing that I want to do is tell the story first? Retell a big part. Be more true to the genre of the text, as it were. Tell the narrative, right? In which case I may say, illustrate, apply, and explain. In fact, this is known as the more standard inductive model, in which case, up here, the main point statement comes first. In the inductive model, you're actually working toward the main point. Now I want you to believe X. Right? And I may reapply it at that point. So the application here may only be identifying the situation, then the main point, and then I may bring the situation back up to say how it applies.
With your outline then, how would that?
So in my outline, it would, so I would, if I'm true inductive preaching, these are not main points. These are known as moves, right? All right. So my first move is narrative, right? And the narrative itself, if we just kind of follow standard narrative theory, is situation, complication, what goes wrong, solution, moral. Right? So we're saying, so I may tell the narrative and I have decided at which point am I going to stop to have kind of my first principle to be established, right? So it may be a portion of the narrative, it may be only that, look, so David was prospering, he's doing wonderfully, right? And then the time came when kings went to war. And David stayed home. Why? Or the gapping in the David narratives. Every time that David had victory, he dedicated all he had to the Lord. And then he became king and he had victory. And it never again says he devoted anything to the Lord. So what am I doing? I'm trying to say, what is the narrative teaching me to get to the principle of what am I to believe? And it could be something like, in times of prosperity, we need to remember the Lord. It may be the principle that I'm getting to. It may be a principle of when God's people are under stress, it's not the time for leaders to stay home or stay comfortable or something. But I'm looking for what principle, and I may have to tell the narrative to get to the principle rather than flip it, which sometimes takes away the plot movement, as it were. And if the ice had not been here, you would have heard more about this. But my goal is to, honestly, my goal is to have guys who are, one of the difficult things for my heart at one point was going to a friend of mine who'd been taught by a lot of things from me and others. And I preached in his church over a series of nights. Can't remember what I was preaching more, but basically narratives. And at the end of my time, he said something like, "How do you do that?" I said, "What?" He said, how do you preach stories?" He said, "I don't know how to do that." He said, "I only preach from the epistles and the Psalms." Whoa. And I thought, what did we not teach you? And honestly, what he was doing was he just did not know how to answer this question. What does God want me to believe? He only knew how to look at the text and say, what does the text say? And having the pastoral incentive of instructing people, he only knew how to do that out of the Psalms and the epistles, because it's kind of done for you already, right? So he wasn't able to say, what does this narrative teach me to believe? And if you'll ask that question, which is a very fair question of the text, it kind of revolutionizes the way that you write main points, right? If you're not saying, what does the text say? What's the text want me to believe? I'm still going to say what the text says to prove that. So it's still an expository sermon, but it's just getting me ready for application so much earlier. Did I kind of answer your question? So you can work to the principle, or you can state the principle and prove it. It's just inductive versus deductive.
Some narrative, that might be the entire sermon in one sense.
It would. The great danger, honestly, of narrative sermons is what this says right here, and we're not to it yet, is they can become highly moralistic, right? It's just Aesop's fables. David was a bad guy, you be a good guy, So we have to say, if we are going to do narrative preaching, most narrative preaching, so let me check my time here. So most narrative preaching, as taught by us, hardly anybody seems to know this, was introduced out of neo-orthodoxy. Why was it introduced out of neo-orthodoxy? Introduced out of neo-orthodoxy because the presumption was there is no transcendent truth. The only truth you have is the truth of your own experience. Therefore, the only experience that we can have out of the Bible is shared experience. Okay, so the way in which you have the truth that I have is we both share in narrative. We share a narrative experience. And so it comes out of the notion that there is not propositional transcendent truth. Now, it's highly effective communication, right? But the consequence was, for most mainline churches and a lot of evangelicals who loved the engagement of narrative, is they forgot the philosophy behind it. And so they became basically moralistic preachers, telling some version of Aesop's fable, you be a good boy too, right? And thinking they were preaching and not recognizing This narrative is in the larger redemptive narrative, and therefore it has a redemptive truth to communicate, not just the narrow little moral of this story, right? And I would just tell you, evangelicals in some ways abandoned their own biblical ethic by adopting a narrative theology without recognizing they had done so, right? They adopted a method, not recognizing they had adopted a theology that was actually undercutting belief. So a lot of what I try when I do inductive teaching is to remind people it's out of the text, and the text has a redemptive context, which is where we're going. Good questions, Josh. Yes, Jacob.
Is there a danger in taking your language almost too high, and that the same 3 or 4 points could come from every sermon? That I think there is, of course, but can you speak to that a little bit?
I think I can if I'm understanding you correctly. So a lot of the questions that sometimes come on, again, word it various ways, redemptive preaching, Christ-centered preaching, gospel-oriented preaching, grace-driven preaching, it's just the same message every week, right? So God instructs this, you can't do it, so trust Jesus. Or trust your justification. It's some version of that. So my response is usually, and you're nodding, so I think I'm going the right direction. Okay. So my responses are this way. Hardly anybody says, your sermons are just the same every week. This is God's law, do it, and you'll be okay with God. Well, why don't they say that? If you're not redemptively oriented, that's the same message. Because there's so many dimensions of the law, right? But when it comes to grace, the presumption is it's just the same message over and over again. God requires something, you can't do it, so trust Jesus. Well, that's not where I am. Because I started here. What was the reason for the text? And as many dimensions as there are to the law, if I will actually go into the text and I say, what was the burden? What was the struggle? And how is the Holy Spirit giving you the divine answer for that specific struggle? Then just as there are so many dimensions of obedience, there are that many dimensions of grace. So any summary is not being fair to the specifics of the text. And so to your point, if I have been specific, and my language usually the more specific and personal the FCF, the more powerful it is. Okay? So the more specific and personal the FCF, the more it's going to drive sharply into people. And you have to say, I got to deal with that issue, right? Not just sin's bad, don't do it, and trust Jesus. Oh, and by the way, you can't not do it, so still trust Jesus. I'm actually going a very different direction, where I'm actually going to be going, hopefully before we get done today, to say this struggle doesn't just have a forgiveness answer, it has a power answer. It's not just, by the way, you can't do it. I want to say, by the way, you can do it. And you're being called to. And that's why the Holy Spirit put it there. The answer to the struggle is not simply your justification. The answer to the struggle is that you're no longer a slave. And you need to embrace that reality so that you recognize that what the law requires, rightly understood, is what God is enabling. So I do recognize that if you just do a general schematic, you can go against either law or grace, right? It's just the same thing every week. Obedience, 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 obedience. It's just the same thing every week. God's good, God's good, God. Well, actually, nobody who's credible is doing that, on either side. Okay. I'm just checking here to see where we are in time. Let me do a little bit more. All this has been on the first question, which was the what question, okay? So in order to be able to answer the what question, that is, what instructions are here, that actually begins not down here in application, right? The actual what to do begins in the formation of the terms of the main points, in which we're actually answering the question, what does God want me to believe? All right? So that's going to form part of the application even in the explanation. Do you recognize what's happening? If this was an art class, what would we be doing? I'd say, here's red paint, and here's blue paint, and here's green paint. And then you start to paint and you go, wait a second, these things are all kind of doing this, right? So what are we doing? We're saying there's explanation, there's illustration, there's application. And what happens when we really start thinking through the model? We start, whoa, these things are all doing this, right? They're all coming together in their different forms. So we recognize that even the intro is starting application with the FCF, right? That is introducing the burden or the reason for the text. Then, as we begin a first main point, explanation, where we have a main point statement, we recognize that is not merely a description, right? It is what do you want me to believe, right? Now, what are we going to do with that? So we'll go back to what's going to happen to it, right? Explanation, illustration, application, right? So I'm going to say, what do you want me to believe? So now I've got subpoints, right? And I'm going to illustrate it at some point. But now I'm going to say, I have to apply this truth, this belief that I talked about. What's our second question? Not only what to do, but where. That means I need to define a situational concrete, right? So if I'm pastoring, I'm dealing with people's real worlds, not just my world, but their reality, not just my reality, but their reality. I need to identify a situation in which people are applying that truth. So, and the one I was doing with Noah, if it is follow God's instruction, come high water or ridicule, follow God's instruction. You all do it. I gave some examples from your church. If you really could just sit across the table from God's people, somebody in your church who's in some situation, regardless of ridicule or high water coming that you know is going to come, you stay faithful to God, follow God's instruction. What are some situations that you know people might be facing in your church that have to deal with that? Don't tell me who they are. Tell me their situations. Jake, you want to try?
Sexual fidelity.
Okay, so you got young people where, everybody else is doing it. Why not me? So sexual fidelity. So I will tell you, usually the first concrete is the one that's most described. Okay, so even to mention it, all right, you need to follow God's instruction. Even when your friends are sexually active, and it seems like even the teachers at school are encouraging it, and the counselors people go to are encouraging it, God is calling you to go against the currents of culture and to believe He has a better plan for your life. And He's calling you to sexual purity, even where it seems like nobody else is going to do it, and you're going to be made fun of for doing it. I'm telling you, your life will be better long term, and God will preserve marriage and you, and all the things, okay? Now, what I just did was, I took this truth, came way up here, this principle, and I used its wording about following God's instruction, and I brought it down to a situation with which people can identify in my church. Now, the solus spiritus people automatically have a problem. Do you recognize it? I knew you were going to do that, right? Here's this huge biblical principle. Follow God's instruction. And you just put a fence around it. And every businessman who's struggling with being honest on his expense reports, and every Army recruiter who's wondering what I should say or not say in order to meet my quota or I'm out of a job and my family's suffering, they don't even have to think about following God's instruction because you limited everything to the sexual purity of teenagers. Here are the question. So how do we deal with it? We break down the wall. Okay? And the way we break down the wall is I presume that in order to show I understand the reality of people, or I have to deal with somebody's reality. And so I talked about teenagers and sexual purity. But I don't end there. I say, folks, it's not just teenagers who are struggling against ridicule. Some of you are struggling to be faithful because it is your coworkers who are ridiculing you, maybe angry at you because you're staying honest on your expense reports. And it's not just business people. I will tell you, there are some people who are engaged in college and they are saying, listen, everybody's got to cheat to be able to advance in career, to get into grad school. Everybody knows that. And you're not willing to do it. You may not get in grad school because of it. And you're being made fun of because, and it may not, okay. The first concrete is the one most fully described. The first concrete is the one most fully described. Then we unroll to other possibilities to show the truth is not limited to that situation. Do you all know what a mag light is? You remember what mag lights are? The flashlight, that you focus the beam by twisting the top. The way I think of it is, I have got this biblical truth. That's what's being developed in this message. So I'm got this truth to shine into life. This first situation focuses the beam. Okay, I'm focusing the beam. This is what that looks like in real life. Now that I got the beam focused, what can I do with it? I can say, and here, and here. And folks, you can also figure where it applies in your life. So I recognize the sola spiritus objection, but I'm not willing to take it out of real life nor settle for one real life situation. I do typically have to develop the situation, which means often the illustration is what? The first situation. Listen to preachers that you really, really respect, and it takes that green paint, blue paint, red paint stuff, and you recognize what they're doing. All of us were taught at some point, usually in preacher training, the purpose of the illustration is to clarify the explanation. And I will tell you, it is not. The primary purpose of the illustration, I didn't say no purpose, but the primary purpose of the illustration is not to clarify. The primary purpose of the illustration is to motivate. Okay? Otherwise, you'll do this. You'll say, my explanation was really clear, so I don't need an illustration. No! If your explanation is very clear, you need to show people where it applies so they are motivated to take that truth into the reality of their lives. The primary, so that means, and you're doing it, Jacob, even with your hands, we tend to think of illustration operating retroactively toward the explanation. It will just change, revolutionize, bring lights on in people's eyes when we start using the illustration to prepare for the application. Right? Now, if we are using common terms, right, that are being woven through, follow God's instruction, right? That's what I developed in the explanation. Then when I tell the illustration, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about young people who still need to do what? Follow God's instruction. So even the illustration is using those terms, which is getting me ready for the application that now comes with God's authority. And by the way, I'm not just saying, come up with something, so stay pure no matter where you are. Well, where did the text say that? No, I'm taking the instruction, applying it to the situation. So I've got to use the same terminology to maintain my authority for where I got that truth. But it means that, I just can't tell you, it just kind of, for my own preaching, it's, I get it. That this situation is often this illustration. And so I'm not just thinking I need to come up with something like the frog in the kettle, something kind of entertain people for a little bit. It's like, no. What I really need to think about is the situations my people face and be willing to talk about, if not them, people like them. And actually believe that's part of the applicational focus, not just the explanation clarification. right? That just deadens your preaching. And it's where you yourself begin to think, oh, little tales for little minds. I just need to entertain them a little bit so they're falling asleep. Instead, you actually feel this heart thrust. How can I be talking about real situations where this truth makes a difference? And your own heart kind of gets this zeal for identifying the situational realities or similarities in which your people live. Go ahead, Tyshawn.
If that's the aim and purpose, then that would require a certain selection on not only the particular illustration, but how we dispense that. Am I correct?
You are correct. Now, and you're asking in a good way. I find, and we said this before, this is why application is so very hard, because the explanation is supplied to you out of the commentaries, right? But to have application where I'm really thinking, who in my church needs to hear this? What are they struggling with? And if I'm not going to mention them by name, what have I read or researched or come across that deals with people in similar situations that I can talk about? And it's why, I know a number of you will do it already, why I have what I call pre-sermon files. You know, I usually know what I'm going to be preaching about some months ahead of time, and I keep every one of those Sundays in a separate sermon file with the text and the title of what's coming. And part of it is just fear, you know, of kind of like, I hate the notion on Saturday, you know, kind of go, oh no, you know, what am I going to, you know. I love having a file that's kind of overflowing with more than I can handle, right? So that I'm not in that Saturday night fever of what am I going to come up with, you know. But I've kind of got that pre-sermon file that's got, ideas that have built over time. And that includes, as you were just saying, if I know kind of what's coming, I'm going to be in my reading and my pastoral experiences and listening to other pastors, all those kinds of things. I'm going to kind of know the kinds of stuff I need to be thinking about, right? But it's really hard about, 11 o'clock Saturday night to be coming up with meaningful ones of these, right? So we have to sometimes, obviously, but it makes a difference. Which means what we've covered so far is the what, right? Which means even the wording of the main points are, what does God want me to believe, right? Which means this is actually being answered way up here in a main point. Even in the main point statement, the instruction starts to appear. It'll get specified more. I know that. You do too, in the subpoints and maybe even down here. But we also have to answer the where question. And the where question comes with situational specificity, right? The questions we've not dealt with yet are the why and the how.